it gives me great pleasure to introduce Anna Daroczi from Budapest, and Anna has a master's degree in gender studies from Central European University. She also studied, as did Peter, at Utrecht Lorraine. I did it wrong. Utrecht Lorraine University. Something like that. Utrecht Lorraine University in Budapest, and in intercultural psychology, and she has a bachelor's degree in social education from the Catholic University of Budapest. Anna's talk today will be titled Women's Health in the EU Roma Integration Framework, 2011, and the Hungarian National Social Inclusion Strategy of 2011, Underlying Presumptions and Implicit Goals. So join me in welcoming Anna to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you hear me? I'm in the interpreter. As you can see from my title, it seemingly has nothing to do with education. And I was supposed, my initial plan for this MA was to analyze not only women's health aspect of these policy documents, but education as well. But for time and space constraint, I couldn't. But I'm planning to do this in the future, and also the other two priority areas, housing and employment. So I'm open for any suggestions. I will be quite theoretical, and as I said, seemingly has nothing to do with this thesis with education, but I believe that a global understanding of what is happening around us and why could lead us to design more successful strategies for social change. I conducted a critical discourse analysis of the excerpts of the mentioned policy documents concerning women's health and linked their underlying assumptions to the functioning of the biopolitical state, colonial governmentality. Okay. Okay, should I repeat? Okay. So, to the functioning of the biopolitical state, colonial governmentality, and the position of the nation-state within a civilizational slope in Europe. I'm talking mainly about Hungary because the EU Roma framework is quite broad and short to be analyzed. Why did I choose these documents exactly? As you might know, and I'm sure you do, the basic goal of them is to address the marginalization, social exclusion of the Romani population and to eliminate the extreme poverty experienced by significantly big numbers of Roma, preeminently by their integration into the labor market. As these documents determine future political actions concerning Roma for the next 7 years and beyond, in my opinion, it is worth analyzing the underlying presumptions and the implicit priorities and aims in them. The Hungarian strategy is said to be one of the best national Roma strategies because, according to the criticizers, it manages to reinforce the differences, thus racism, implicitly, whereas other strategies do the same quite directly. The criticisms, which reflect on the gender aspects of the document, are concerned mainly with the lack of gender mainstreaming as an objective of the framework. Some deplore that no measures have been established concerning gender equality. So far, I haven't found much criticisms concerned with the stereotypical representation of Romani women and Roma, but as Romani women as mothers and primary caregivers in the document, although we know that many times they are the ones who secure the income of the whole family as well. why do I concentrate on women and health besides graduating from the gender studies department? And besides being a Romani woman who feels responsibility. I regard health as a disciplinary discourse through which people beyond the individual level are being regulated as masses, after Foucault, and particularly women's health has an important role in exercising power over populations, and as control mechanisms are being inscribed on women's bodies through reproduction policies. So I am 80% sure that I could analyze other aspects of the documents as well with very similar findings, but I chose health because I believe this is the most visible and obvious disciplinary discourse. My main questions are the following. What is meant by integration of Roma and Romani women in the documents? How is the disintegratedness of Roma understood? How are Roma being created as a problem through the policies? And how are Romani women constructed discursively by these documents? I argue that the EU Roma framework and the Hungarian National Social Inclusion Strategy, in spite of their declared goal, which is the economic and social integration of the Roma population of Europe and Hungary, create a picture about Roma as a homogeneous group and as clearly distinguishable from the non-Roma. Doing so, the policymakers reaffirm the existing stereotypes about Roma, which is in opposition with the vision of integration. The policy documents create an imaginary about Roma as a homogeneous group. When using the word imaginary, I refer to the assertion of Edward Said about the Orient, that it is, quote, not an inert fact of nature, but an idea that has a history and a tradition of thought, imagery, and vocabulary that have given it reality and presence, end quote. And I am extending his claim to the other in general, and so to the Roma, in this case, and Romani women. By creating this imaginary, the policymakers reaffirm and rebuild the stereotypes about us. Let me introduce the theories I have used. I build in my thesis mainly on Foucault's notion of the biopolitical mode of power, which was explained by him in The Birth of Biopolitics and Society Must Be Defended. He claims that there is an ongoing war between different groups of the society, but not in the way one usually thinks about war, rather through the discourses of creating and defining the nationhood and its inhabitants, its citizens. According to his historical overview, until the 18th century, the sovereign, such as the king or the Caesar, etc., exercised power over the people according to his right to let live and make die. They were disciplined as individuals, but due to the shift from this mode of functioning in the era of the social contract, the political power exercises the right to make live and let die on the statistical level, regulating people as masses. This is what Foucault calls the biopolitical mode of power. People are being described by statistical numbers referring to their lives, such as births and mortality rates, life expectancy, and so on. Managing the lives of masses through figures, thanks to which populations and events are more predictable, and through intervention aimed at groups of people rather than at individuals, is what constitutes biopolitics. Initially, the role of this regulatory power is to preserve, to defend the population from external and internal threats. Foucault argues that the contradiction between the protecting function of the state and the fact that it still kills or let's die excludes parts of its population from this frame of protection is resolved by the inherent racist nature of the state. He asserts that the state's aim is to maintain a state of equilibrium through collecting data and intervening on a mass statistical level if there is a deviation. In order to keep the balance, to normalize this mass, to be able to deal with them more easily, some parts of the society always have to be favored on the expense of the others. So racism serves the preserving function of the state. For how being Roma gets conflated with being poor, as I will argue later. Being poor, uneducated, and so on, as we all know the stereotypes, and why, neo-Marxist explanation of Wallerstein can answer. He observes that in the construction of nationhood there are three important categories, whereabout race is a genetic, visible one, nation is a socio-political one based on mainly territorial location, and ethnicity is a category based on certain forms of behaviors, ensuring a cultural continuity. He believes that ethnic groups emerge from the need of the majority for a minority in terms of social power and labor division. The need for distinction between different groups of society can be explained with the need of different normal behavior by the workforce, by the different levels of the workforce. Different modes of behavior are usually taught and not genetically determined to people and are referred to as culture of the different groups in order to justify their hierarchical reality of capitalism. He also claims that this pressure for the groups to behave in a certain way can be formal, done by state apparatuses, but as it would violate the concept of national equality, it is finally done by the group itself as voluntary group behavior, defending social identity, and through internalizing the stereotypes into the own cultural imagination of an ethnic group. It is done voluntarily. Basically, I wanted to understand why, if we have the tools, we usually know what we should do, why we don't have the political support of the nation state. And for this, I was trying to put this discourse in a wider European discourse. And for this, I used the work of Attila Meleg on the east-west slope, the east-west civilizational slope in Europe, who states that from the 80s, the geopolitical and geocultural imagination has been recaptured by the idea of the civilizational or east-west slope, where the West represents development and did I say the West? I wanted to say the West represents development and civilization, whereas East represents underdevelopment or non-development and barbarism. The vertical dimension of this frame of reference is merit. Most often it's manifested in racial or, in this case, ethnical terms. He claims that nation states, especially those in Central Eastern Europe, due to their relatively recent re-entering the capitalist world system, are struggling to locate themselves on this civilizational slope. He also claims that racism and the disciplining, the normalization of groups who at the same time are being stigmatized are parts and parcels of the modern political systems of domination. He suggests that Central European countries are in between the West and the Balkan, where the Balkan has been represented as non-white, and that they would like to gain. So Central Eastern European countries, and in this case, especially Hungary, is in between the West and the Balkan, where the Balkan represents the non-white part of the slope, and that these states would like to gain their places in the developed white side of the slope. In other words, what I would like to argue, that Roma and the strategy are tools that make it possible not to talk about themselves, Hungarians, about their own population, but to define themselves as whites, I mean Hungarians, with using the discourse about Roma. The next big framework I put my arguments in is that of colonialism or post-colonialism. And by colonization, I do not mean the processes throughout history of gaining and exercising power over the lands and properties of far populations and establishing a system of governance to assist that, but a set of practices of establishing dominance over a people by changing their existing social practices. One could say that in that sense, governance is always colonization, as it strives for the normalization of people's lives by altering their behaviors. What makes a difference in the case of minority groups is that the justification for these alterations of the behaviors are based on cultural differences, and referring to cultural characteristics always involve ethical value judgments and create imaginations of the minority groups as others, not like us, the majority. The tools of the colonizers for establishing their power over native populations, such as measuring them statistically and describing them as divergent from the norm, are strongly consonant with the descriptions and measures of the EU Roma strategy and the Hungarian framework. Timothy Mitchell, for example, argues that the establishment of a healthcare system makes it possible to enumerate and register the bodies of the people, which makes possible the control over people as masses, which helps intervention on a collective level in order to change the bodily practices of the target group, and the reason behind which was the exploitation of the reproductive capacities of the native population. In my opinion, or as I see it, this can be explicitly read in the main goals of the policies, that is, to increase the income, the GDP of the nation states by introducing Roma to the labor market. Here I have to present that Roma are present on the labor market, although not in the acknowledged ways. They are present on not only the black market, but especially in the case of women. They are responsible mostly for the domestic labor, and they are also present in these invisible layers of the labor market. Thus, in my opinion, it would not be the introduction of Roma to the labor market, but the alteration of their existing presence there. I would not like to go into details to say who are Roma, where they come from, as we all know. But I would like to mention that I believe that describing Roma along the story of exclusion and suffering, showing them as victims, how it is usually done and presented in public discourse, together with the vivid anti-Roma sentiment prevalent in Europe and very strongly and explicitly in Hungary, help the justification of the strategy and the framework in this sense. And now what I found in the documents about women's health. How are they defined by the policy documents? The EU framework states that the life expectancy of Romani women is 10 years lower than that of non-Romani women, without providing any empirical data, which I view asserts sides' argument in connection with the creation of the other, that the idea of a group, the data and terms referring to them, give reality and presence to their existence as a group, as a homogeneous group, regardless of whether the figures reflect the truth or not. What is more important in this segment of the Hungarian, of my thesis, is that the policymakers attribute low life expectancy to Roma's lack of access to quality health care, when they assert that the change of the latter, a better access to quality health care, will reduce the differences in life expectancy and child mortality rate between Roma and non-Roma. With this assertion, the role of other factors, such as housing, education, and so on, are being ignored. Also, Romani women in the documents appear as a target group rather than agents of their own future, and are usually mentioned together with children, which can be also problematic from a feminist perspective. It implies that they either have the same level of agency or that they are closely attached units of the family. In the Hungarian strategy, Romani women are being defined by their statistical differences from non-Roma along 5 major issues I want to present here briefly. The first is life expectancy, particularly in Hungary. Life expectancy and other numbers describing the health state of a specific segment of a population can be viewed as serving 2 aims according to postcolonial literature and development studies. On the representational level, creating and presenting indexes about poor health conditions create a picture of underdeveloped group of people, thus falling outside of the category of the Western developed world. Also, as Appadurai claims, presenting statistical health-related data encourages and justifies on the disciplinary level the need of introducing those people affected to the healthcare system, which serves or can serve the process of enumeration in order to produce a manageable and governable population. Also, it's worth mentioning that in the 20th century onward, we have been embedded in nation states where health and individual responsibility of our own biology became constructive of our citizenship. So, presenting shorter life expectancy and through this the lower state of health of Romani women and Roma in general not only emphasizes the need for state intervention, but at the same time implies that Romani women are irresponsible when not taking care of their health and their children's health. Getting back to Foucault's assertions, to secure the protection of the life of a population, for these parts of it have to be sacrificed for the benefit of the majority. In order to be able to choose who to let die, some groups of the society must be regarded as inferior. Thus, the creation of a distinctive group is necessary, and in my point of view, it is what we witness in the case of the framework and the Hungarian strategy as well. The next big theme concerning Romani women is the self-destructive behavior. It is stated in the document, in the Hungarian strategy, that Romani women are more likely to smoke during their pregnancies than non-Roma. which is said to be important from the future children's perspective in the strategy and not for the sake of the woman's health itself. This asserts that self-destructive behavior during pregnancy is a political act, showing, in this case, that they don't show responsibility for the future generation, unlike ethnic Hungarians. Also, presenting this 10%, which you can read there, is not telling in itself, as we have no data, at least in the document, about the self-destructive behavior of the general Hungarian population during pregnancy. A very strong topic concerning Romani women in the Hungarian strategy, and which we hear every week or every day about Roma, is the theme of early motherhood. Throughout the document, it is being generalized to Romani women, and instead of looking at it as a result of something, it is said to be the reason for most of the inequalities between Roma and non-Roma. What also needs to be taken into consideration that in the public discourse in Hungary, women are being encouraged to have children and have children earlier than they usually do. So what is seen as desirable for Hungarians is undesirable for Roma. I do not want to say that early motherhood is favorable, but that this is another point where the window dressing and the racism can be tackled within the strategy. It is also a point where poverty and ethnicity are being conflated, as the document says that non-Roma in the same regions and living among similar socio-economic circumstances follow the same pattern. Which is also a topic very often heard about Romani women, is abortion versus contraception. Abortion against is not problematized because of its effect on the women's health and life itself, but because it is said to increase the possibility of premature birth in the future. This is a point where racism can be tackled also in the text. Although a pro-natalist discourse is prevalent in Hungary, it is selective. Abortion is not encouraged on the one hand because of the rise of the importance of Hungary's Christianness, and because the more abortions performed, the more mentally children are said to be born, on the other. But as Roma have been stigmatized even in policy documents since the 60s on a class and ethnic basis, birth control has been encouraged in order to lower the number of worse quality citizens. The reason for this is the fear that with the birth rates of Roma and non-Roma following the now existing trend for the next few decades, the Hungarian population will be replaced by, and I quote from Attila Meleg, will be replaced by a frugal but life-adoring and fertile gypsy population, end quote. What was very interesting for me that all these trends of Romani women were and are explained by the traditional gender roles. In indirect relation to the health condition of Romani women, traditional gender roles are mentioned several times. The argument goes through the document as follows. Romani women's health is affected by their early dropout from school, which stems partly from their roles in the traditional family. Traditional gender roles in the family are mentioned as an explanation for women's disadvantages, but the document never explicates its meaning. The use of the term traditional gender roles without describing its meaning mystifies the conditions of Roma live among, and implicitly attribute them to their cultural characteristics, that is to say, to their ethnicity. In this way, socio-economic conditions through traditional gender roles, early motherhood, school dropout rates and low employment rates of women become the outcomes of their ethnic belonging. This is how poverty becomes ethnicized through the document. In itself, it's very interesting that traditional gender roles are mentioned in the policy document as a cause of socially detrimental consequences, while in the public discourse about the general population, something very different is happening. We can hear from politicians that women's emancipation, the stepping out from the traditional family structure, the professional aspirations of women, can be blamed for the decrease of the Hungarian population. This topic and controversy leads us back again to the self-definition and position of a nationhood on this developmental civilizational slope. In this aspect, Roma, with their traditional gender roles, can provide a point of reference compared to whom ethnic Hungarians are more developed or civilized. On the other hand, being insistent on and proud of following Christian traditions can appear only in domestic, public, and political discourse. Roma are being defined as different from ethnic Hungarians in terms of the gender roles practiced in their families in the strategy. Taking into consideration the willingness of Hungary to belong to Europe, it serves as a reference for locating the nation on this slope, presenting that Hungarians are more progressed than the Roma. At the end, I would like to attract the attention on these two terms we usually, maybe not we, but many people usually use interchangeably. In the EU Roma framework, the EU Roma framework talks about integration, but in the Hungarian strategy we cannot really read, and at least in the title, integration, but inclusion. According to many definitions, and as you can see on the slide, the definition of the United Nations, the term integration can be defined as a mutual process which requires the flexibility of both or all parties which want to take part in this integration process. But the Hungarian strategy aims at inclusion instead of integration, which can simply be understood as inserting a group into an already existing system without changing this. Nevertheless, I argue, taking into consideration my findings, that where the strategy documents read inclusion, what they mean is the normalization of Roma. By normalization, I mean what Foucault explains again in Discipline and Punish, and about which we have already talked about in connection with the creation of the good citizens. As the statistical numbers of the average population of Hungary are presented, and the corresponding numbers among the Roma or poor population are being compared to those, implying that the average is the optimum that should be converged to by all groups, including Roma, they begin, these statistical numbers, to operate as the norm. This happens along with the creation of a hierarchy between the figures, when the policy documents assert that the situation of the Roma should be improved. The differences between Roma and non-Roma can be understood along these statistical numbers, and at the same time the populations themselves are being valued on a scale representing a hierarchical relationship between the two groups. Thus the ones who are divergent from the norm or optimum are seen as abnormal. Not only the existence of this hierarchy creates a control mechanism of conformity, but the policies explicitly contain that the numbers should be evened. Deviation from this norm is seen as abnormality. This also creates an imaginary of two homogeneous groups, the Hungarians and the Roma. By stating that Romani women have lower life expectancy, are more likely to smoke during their pregnancy, give birth earlier, determine their pregnancy more often than non-Roma, are less likely to use contraceptive methods and correspond to traditional gender roles. The policymaker implies that to be a Romani woman equals being underprivileged, poor, and uneducated. The implications of this homogenization, and especially of culturalizing these characteristics with emphasizing traditional gender roles, fit together with the theory of Immanuel Wallenstein I have introduced earlier. Taking into consideration that the main aim of the EU framework and the Hungarian strategy is the economic integration of Roma in order to increase the GDP of the countries, and in this case Hungary, the Roma need to be created as a homogeneous group through normalization, then to be integrated so that they can occupy workplaces that fit to their characteristics, which are at the same time low-status jobs. For example, there are recommendations in the documents that the jobs provided for Roma can be cleaning roads, participating in state-financed constructions, and so on. And instead of conclusions, to be honest, conducting this research or study put more questions than answers into my head, and I would really like to hear your opinion about these questions, because and also I would like to, before somebody asks me what are my solutions in this situation for the Roma issue, according to these theories, I mean, I am playing kind of the devil's advocate with this thesis, because according to these theories, it is not in the interest of the nation state to integrate, not the Roma, because as we have already talked about it, we are integrated, but to integrate the value system or our episteme or identity or whatever we can call, so that it is not in the interest of the nation state. I wonder how can we somehow pressure and how can we encourage for change.